My name is Zoe Ellis, and at 34 years old, I've carved out a life that, on the surface, looks like a careful balancing act between a demanding career and the unrelenting tide of family obligations. By day, I'm a senior project manager at a mid-sized tech company. Somewhere between the chaos of deadlines and the precision of orchestrating teams, I thrive. I'm the person everyone counts on to keep projects on track, schedules aligned, and crises at bay. Yet, beneath the polished professionalism is a quieter, more complicated story. I'm also the go-to person for my family, the invisible glue holding many of their moving parts together. It's a role I didn't exactly sign up for, but one that seemed to have been assigned by default the moment I became the eldest niece. I've become the one who quietly manages childcare whenever family events pop up, the one who coordinates logistics when relatives get overwhelmed, the one who absorbs everyone else's expectations without complaint. I don't tell them how exhausting it is to juggle a 50-hour work week and still make sure my toddler nephew has a snack or that my sister-in-law's kids are entertained. I don't bring up how I sometimes lose sleep over organizing birthday parties or helping my aging aunt with errands after a long day at the office. I just do it, because that's what family is supposed to be, right? And yet, there's an unspoken weight that comes with being the family's fallback. I feel it in the way my parents, Karen and Richard, look at me sometimes, like I'm just someone who's always available, a resource rather than a person. There's a tension beneath the surface, subtle but persistent, like a low hum you only notice when everything else goes quiet. They rarely say it outright, but I catch the sighs when I decline yet another favor, or the quick shifts in conversation when topics get too personal. I sense an unspoken resentment that they never voice, and, honestly, I'm not sure I want to hear. Lately, that tension has been growing. Family gatherings feel less like warm reunions and more like rehearsed performances where I'm expected to play my part flawlessly. The subtle hints have been everywhere. In passing comments during phone calls, in the frequent messages in the family WhatsApp group, and in the sideways glances when I mention my own plans. There's an upcoming event that's been casting a shadow for weeks now. My cousin Melissa's wedding. A celebration that, in theory, should bring joy and excitement feels more like a looming obligation. I know deep down that my role won't be the guest of honor or even a supportive attendee. Instead, I'm bracing myself for the unspoken expectation that I'll be the unpaid nanny for a swarm of kids and the invisible manager of chaos. Just yesterday, the family group chat buzzed with a new message. The notification popped up on my phone. Melissa's wedding is just around the corner. Heads up, there will be quite a few kids to look after. Zoe, maybe you can help with that? The casual tone stung, as if it were a given that I'd drop everything to become the default babysitter. My heart sank a little. That message wasn't an invitation. It was a mandate disguised as a request. I stared at the words, feeling that familiar knot tighten in my stomach, wondering how many more times I'd have to swallow my exhaustion and put on a smile. Balancing this all, the career, the toddler at home, and the silent demands of a family that leans on me like I'm their safety net, is wearing me down. I keep reminding myself why I do it, because family matters, because love means sacrifice, because I want to be the one who holds us together. But sometimes, I wonder if they see me at all, or if I'm just background noise in the soundtrack of their lives. The wedding is coming, and with it, a test of how much more I can give before I break. I've spent so many years playing the family's emotional and logistical fallback that sometimes it feels like my identity has been reduced to little more than a reliable backup plan. I remember vividly how this pattern started early on, woven into the fabric of our family dynamics before I even realized what was happening. My younger brother Jason, for example, he's always been the golden child in my parents' eyes. From the time we were kids, he was celebrated for the smallest achievements, a good grade, a sports win, even just his charming smile at the right moment. Meanwhile, I was the one quietly stepping in when things needed to get done, the one who cleaned up messes, soothed tears, organized ruined birthday parties, and made sure everyone else's needs were met, even if it meant putting my own aside. I can still recall specific moments that crystallized this unfair divide, like the summer when I was 12 and my parents were off on a trip. leaving me to watch over Jason and our 2 younger cousins. I begged to join a camp with my friends, the kind of place that promised adventure and freedom. But instead, I was handed the keys to the house and a list of duties that included everything from cooking simple meals to keeping all the kids entertained and out of trouble. Jason got to stay home doing whatever he wanted, free from responsibility, while I became the unofficial mini-parent. It never felt like a choice, more like an unspoken expectation. Family dinners were another stage where this disparity played out. While everyone praised Jason for his latest accomplishments, often exaggerated or oversold by my parents, I sat quietly, my efforts invisible. I remember one particular evening when Jason announced his acceptance into an elite college, and the room erupted in applause. I smiled and clapped along, but inside, I felt like a ghost. No one asked about my job, my projects, or even how I was doing. It was as if my existence was only relevant when something needed fixing or organizing. Karen, my mother, had a way of favoring Melissa, my cousin and the star of the family, much like she did with Jason. Melissa's every wish was indulged, and her failures excused, while I was expected to be the steady foundation beneath the chaos. I tried to convince myself that this was just how families worked, that some people naturally took the lead, and others supported from behind the scenes. I told myself that Karen's favoritism was just a quirk of our family dynamic, that it didn't mean she loved me any less. But deep down, the pattern was clear and painful. While Jason and Melissa were enveloped in praise and protection, I was the one who absorbed the burdens no one else wanted, babysitting when it was convenient for others, managing schedules nobody else could be bothered to coordinate, and providing emotional support without ever being asked if I needed any in return. This ongoing imbalance bred a quiet resentment I rarely gave voice to. When I was younger, I internalized it as guilt, feeling selfish whenever I wanted time for myself, like I was letting the family down. But as the years passed and the pattern persisted, resentment grew, simmering beneath the surface. I started noticing how my parents' eyes would glaze over when I asked for help or mentioned my own struggles. Karen would brush off my concerns with a tired, "You're strong, Zoe. You can handle it," as if my strength was a resource to be exploited, not an attribute to be respected. I also noticed the unspoken hierarchy in family conversations, how Jason's opinions were sought after and valued, while mine were often dismissed or ignored. Melissa, on the other hand, wielded her entitlement like a shield, safe in the knowledge that Karen would always back her up, no matter the cost. At family dinners, when Melissa spoke about her plans for the wedding or complained about small inconveniences, everyone listened attentively, nodding in agreement. When I tried to share my own thoughts, I was met with polite smiles or quick topic changes. It was as if my role had been written: support the shining stars, keep the machinery running, but never expect center stage. Looking back, it's clear how deeply these patterns have shaped my relationship with my family. Being the dependable fallback, the one everyone turns to when things go wrong, has ingrained a habit of silent sacrifice. Yet, it has also hollowed out parts of me, leaving a lingering question about my value beyond utility. This history of being overshadowed and overlooked fuels a growing frustration. I feel like I've been carrying a burden no one acknowledged, expected to be endlessly patient and giving, while my own needs were sidelined or trivialized. That's why, as Melissa's wedding approaches, I can't shake the feeling that this event will be another chapter in this familiar story. The unease I feel isn't just about the logistics or the exhaustion, it's about the recognition, or lack thereof, that seems to accompany my role. Melissa and Jason will be celebrated. I will be left to keep everything running quietly in the background, as I always have. The entire family seems poised to assume that I'll once again be the unpaid nanny, the invisible organizer, the emotional buffer. And after all these years, that assumption feels less like tradition and more like entrapment. I've never been one to complain loud and often. Instead, I've quietly shouldered responsibilities, hoping that if I just kept doing what was expected, one day my family would see me, not just as the default helper, but as someone worthy of acknowledgement and respect. But lately, the sacrifices have been piling up, and the gratitude has been almost non-existent. Take work, for instance. In the last couple of years, I've had 2 serious opportunities to move up professionally. Promotions that would have meant more visibility, better pay, and a chance to stretch myself in new ways. Both times I hesitated and eventually declined. Not because I wasn't capable, but because I knew the timing would clash with family needs. When my aging aunt's health declined, I became the primary scheduler for her doctor visits, medication refills, and household help. That meant taking time off unexpectedly, attending to last-minute crises, and often squeezing work hours into odd pockets of the day. I couldn't hand these responsibilities over to anyone else. No one else volunteered. So I put my career on hold, silently believing it was temporary. Then there was the money. When Melissa started planning her wedding, she was upfront about her budget constraints. I wasn't crazy about lending a large sum for catering and floral arrangements, knowing it might never be paid back on time, or at all, but I did it anyway. I told myself it was for family, for Melissa's big day, and that maybe, just maybe, it would be appreciated. Instead, the loan became another invisible thread tying me to the event's chaos, silently obliging me to be the go-to person for last-minute fixes and favors. When Melissa's own friends bailed on helping with setup, I was the one who rearranged schedules, booked extra help, and ensured the kids would be entertained, all without so much as a thank you. Balancing these responsibilities with my own life hasn't been easy. My husband, Mark, and I have a toddler, and our little family deserves my attention and energy too. But often, my focus is split, eyes on my laptop during nap times, phone in hand answering family texts while trying to prepare dinner. Mark watches quietly, concerned. He sees how I disappear into family obligations and the stress it causes me. Sometimes after a long day, he'll take the toddler for a walk so I can breathe. But even then, I'm haunted by the growing mountain of things left undone or must-dos that seem to multiply overnight. Last month, I had to postpone a much-needed vacation, something Mark and I had planned for months, because my parents suddenly needed help coordinating care for my grandmother, who was recovering from surgery. It wasn't that they asked me directly. Rather, Karen made a pointed comment about how she was glad Zoe was free this weekend. When I mentioned the trip during a family dinner, I canceled without protest, swallowing down the disappointment, telling myself it was just temporary, just one more time. Sometimes I catch myself wondering what it would feel like to say no, to refuse without guilt or explanation. But then I think about the looks, the silent disapproval from Karen, the subtle withdrawal of affection, the way my brother Jason would effortlessly slide back into the spotlight, uninterrupted. It's a delicate balance, one I've learned to maintain through years of practice. Keep the peace, keep the family running, and don't rock the boat. And yet, with Melissa's wedding looming, that old pattern threatens to crush me. The very idea of being the nanny for 10 kids, arranged and expected to manage all the chaos without a moment to enjoy the event, makes my chest tighten. It's not just about the physical exhaustion. It's about feeling invisible once again, used for my dependability rather than valued for who I am. I keep replaying the family group chat message in my head, the casual, "Zoe, maybe you can help with the kids," like a silent demand wrapped in politeness. It's as if my years of sacrifice have been erased, replaced by an assumption that I'll drop everything for them, again and again. The thought makes me want to scream, but instead, I sit with the knot in my stomach, trying to muster enough strength to keep going. Mark has noticed the tension shadowing my usual calm. Last night, he asked gently if I wanted to talk about it. I hesitated, then told him how I feel like I'm constantly giving, yet never really receiving. He nodded, squeezing my hand. "You deserve better," he said simply. Those words felt like a balm and a challenge all at once. As the wedding date approaches, the weight of my sacrifices presses heavier. I'm tired of being the fallback, the unpaid helper, the invisible force holding things together. But I also know that this is more than just about exhaustion. It's about reclaiming myself before I lose all sense of who I am beyond the roles I've been assigned by others. The question is, how do I do that without fracturing the family I've been trying to keep intact all these years? The family brunch started like any other, sunlight filtering through the lace curtains, the clatter of plates and mugs, and the usual hum of overlapping conversations. The dining room was crowded, a mix of cousins, aunts, uncles, and kids, all gathered under one roof with the aroma of coffee and cinnamon rolls weaving through the air. I sat quietly near the window, cradling my cup of tea, watching as familiar faces laughed and caught up. But beneath the surface, the usual undercurrents of unspoken expectations rippled. Karen, my mother, was in her element, flitting from one group to another, her laugh loud and commanding, her eyes sharp and always scanning. When she finally settled at the head of the table, the room seemed to lean in, as if waiting for her next proclamation. And then she said it, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "So, Melissa's wedding is coming up, and there will be 10 children there. I thought Zoe could just handle watching them." The words landed like a cold splash of water. I felt my chest tighten, the warmth of the room suddenly replaced by a wave of heat that seemed to radiate from my face to the tips of my fingers. My grip tightened around the mug, the porcelain pressing hard into my palms. Everyone around the table paused mid-conversation. 10 children. Watch them. As if I were some hired help, or worse, some unpaid nanny whose sole purpose was to watch over a swarm of kids I hadn't agreed to care for. Karen's eyes met mine briefly, her smile unwavering, as if she expected my immediate and unquestioning agreement. "Zoe's so good with kids," she added, her tone light but with an unmistakable edge. "It'll be a big help." "You know how those little ones can get? Melissa's friends aren't used to that kind of responsibility." I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile. The words stung, the implication glaring. The comparison to Melissa's friends was no accident. Those girls, who would attend the wedding carefree and childless, were somehow more worthy of celebration, while I was the default caretaker, the invisible labor force nobody acknowledged. My stomach churned as I tried to find my voice, but it felt tangled in a web of obligation and history. "Of course I understand," I said softly, though my heart screamed otherwise. The room resumed its noise, but I felt conspicuously exposed, as if I were standing on a stage too brightly lit. My husband, Mark, sitting beside me, leaned in and whispered, "Are you okay?" His concern was a quiet anchor, but I shook my head slightly, not trusting myself to speak. Around the table, a few relatives chuckled nervously, offering half-hearted nods or glances away. No one voiced support or pushed back on Karen's statement. It was as if my role had been cemented long ago, permanently cast as the caretaker, the one who would keep the wheels turning so the rest of the family could enjoy the festivities without a care. I felt a swell of humiliation, a familiar ache that I'd buried deep for years, but now bubbled to the surface. Watching 10 children at a wedding was no small task. It would mean long hours, morning through night, chasing, feeding, calming, entertaining. There would be no time to eat, no chance to socialize, no moment to breathe, and all of it expected as a given, without so much as a thank you. Karen continued, oblivious or indifferent to the weight of her expectations, chatting about the catering, the floral arrangements, and the seating plan. Her voice was brisk and authoritative, like a CEO delegating tasks to middle management. I forced myself to listen, to act as if this wasn't a crushing blow, but inside I was unraveling. Mark's hand found mine under the table, squeezing gently. I glanced at him, grateful for his silent support. "You don't have to say yes," he whispered, his voice low enough to escape the ears of others. But the years of conditioning, the unspoken rules of family duty, pressed down on me. I nodded faintly, more out of habit than agreement. As the brunch wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but I remained haunted by Karen's words. The subtle message was clear. My worth in this family was tied to my willingness to sacrifice, to serve without complaint. I wasn't a guest at Melissa's wedding. I was the unpaid help, the invisible force expected to manage chaos so everyone else could enjoy the day. I tried to laugh it off when a cousin made a joke about "Zoe's got this covered," but the humor felt hollow. Inside, the sting of being undervalued pierced deeper. The tension between my desire to be seen and the reality of being used tightened like a vice around my chest. I wondered how many more times I'd be expected to swallow that bitter pill before I found the courage to speak up. As the brunch ended and guests started to leave, I sat back, my mind racing. The wedding, a day that should have been a joyous celebration of love and family, felt more like a looming test of my limits and my will. I caught Karen's eye one last time, and she smiled, the kind of smile that said, "This is just how things are." But I wasn't sure I could keep pretending that was enough. The knot in my stomach grew tighter as I thought about the days ahead, about the 10 children, the endless demands, and the silent expectation that I'd be the one to handle it all. The weight of it settled over me like a shadow, but somewhere beneath the ache, a quiet question began to stir. How much more would I give before I finally said no? A few days before Melissa's wedding, the weight of that brunch conversation still hung heavy on my shoulders. I was trying to focus on work, on the projects that usually kept my mind busy and steady, but the constant buzz of my phone pulled me back into the family drama I was desperate to keep at arm's length. Then, by pure chance, I overheard my mother's voice on the phone, the words cutting through the quiet hum of the house like a cold blade. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes after dinner, when Karen paced back and forth in the living room, phone pressed tightly against her ear. Her voice was calm, but that familiar sharpness underlined every sentence. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the words floated toward me, impossible to ignore. "Yes, I'm telling you, Zoe will be perfect. She's so good with the kids. I don't see why she can't be the one watching all 10 of them during the whole event. From start to finish," she said. The tone clipped, like she was delivering an order rather than asking a favor. I froze, the sponge slipping from my grasp, water suddenly feeling colder, heavier on my skin. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of disbelief and rising anger flooding me. 10 children, all day, no breaks, no help. The sheer scale of it hit me like a wall. My mother was planning to make me the sole nanny, invisible even in the guest list, chained to demands that would drain every ounce of energy I had left. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. I stayed rooted in place, listening as she continued. "Yes, I've told Melissa. She's counting on Zoe being there from the ceremony right through to the buffet closing. It's settled. And no, we don't want the kids' parents hovering or getting involved. It's easier if Zoe just handles it all. It's what she's good at," Karen said, her voice no longer even disguising the expectation, the entitlement. That last sentence stung worse than any rebuke. It's what she's good at. Like I was some hired help, not a daughter or a cousin, not someone with a life or limits or feelings. My hands clenched into fists, the frustration bubbling up into a fierce, burning rage that I'd tried to bury for years. The unfairness of it all was suffocating. All those times I had stepped in without complaint, canceling my own plans, rearranging my work, lending money, managing crises, and now this cold, calculated decision to exclude me from any joy or celebration, to turn me into a shadow at my own family's event. I wanted to shout at her, tell her I wasn't a nanny, that I wasn't her unpaid backup plan or her emotional dumping ground. But Karen's voice had the calm authority that made it clear dissent was pointless. She expected compliance. As I stood there, frozen between the kitchen and the living room, I heard my phone buzz again. I glanced down and saw Melissa's name flashing on the screen. My heart sank further. Reluctantly, I answered, "Zoe, we really need you for the wedding day." Melissa's voice was sharp, almost commanding. "Mom said you'll be with the kids the whole time, from the ceremony until the buffet closes. No breaks. You're the only one who can do it right." I could hear the impatience in her tone, the kind of entitlement that never once considered my own exhaustion or feelings. We all have so much to handle, and honestly, I don't want to worry about the kids. This is your job. Please don't let us down. I swallowed hard, the knot in my stomach tightening into something almost physical. Mark, who had been sitting quietly in the living room, looked up immediately, concern etched into his face. He saw the sudden shift in me, the way my shoulders tensed, how my voice wavered. After I hung up, Mark reached over, his hand steady on mine. "I'm sorry, Zoe," he said softly. "That's not fair." I nodded but couldn't find words. The hurt was raw, deeper than I had allowed myself to feel out loud. The exclusion from the celebration wasn't just about physical presence. It was the message that I was invisible, that my sacrifices didn't count, that my family didn't want me there for me, only for the labor I could provide. The silence between us was heavy. My mind raced, replaying every family event where I'd been sidelined, every sacrifice met with a shrug, every expectation placed without a thank you. The wedding was supposed to be a moment to come together, to celebrate love and family, but for me it was shaping up to be a day of isolation and exploitation. And yet, beneath the hurt and exhaustion, a flicker of something else stirred, a quiet spark of resolve. This time, I wasn't sure I'd say yes. This time, I wasn't sure I would let them take me for granted any longer. The wedding was days away, and for the first time, I felt the weight of my decision pressing down. Whatever happened next, I knew I couldn't keep being invisible in my own family's story. That night, after the house finally quieted down and Mark and our toddler had gone to bed, I sat alone in the dim glow of the living room lamp. The silence pressed around me, a stark contrast to the noise swirling in my mind. I opened my journal, the one I kept tucked away for just such moments, and began to write. Not to organize a schedule or jot down to-dos, but to untangle the knot of emotions I'd been carrying for years. I started with the wedding, the looming event that seemed less like a celebration and more like a weighted chain. As I wrote, memories spilled out onto the pages. The late nights spent coordinating family events, rearranging my own life so others could run smoothly, the countless favors asked and taken for granted. I traced the pattern back to childhood, when my responsibilities quietly multiplied while my brother and cousin were applauded and adored. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that I hadn't just been helping. I'd been the family's invisible employee, unpaid, unacknowledged, and overworked. Each sentence felt heavier than the last. I thought about that brunch, when Mom announced I'd be the sole caregiver for 10 children, her voice so casually dismissive of my own needs. The more I recalled Karen's words, "It's what she's good at," the more they felt like a slap to my identity rather than a compliment. The phrase echoed cruelly in my mind. Good at babysitting. Not good at my job. Not good as a family member. But good at being the default caretaker. The hurt churned inside me. A deep, gnawing grief for all the times I had been overlooked, not just at weddings and family gatherings, but in the years between, in the small moments that built up into a mountain of sacrifice. I remembered the nights I stayed up late helping my aging aunt after long workdays, the vacations I canceled without complaint, the money I lent with the unspoken expectation it would be forgotten. Each memory was a thread in the tapestry of my quiet servitude. But as the grief settled, something else began to rise. Anger. Not the loud, explosive kind, but a slow, fierce fire that warmed the corners of my heart and sharpened my thoughts. I realized that this wasn't just about exhaustion or being taken for granted. It was about respect, about being seen as a person, not a task, about drawing a line between love and exploitation. I thought about the phrase, family first, which they repeated so often. To me, it had always sounded like a mantra, a justification for endless giving. But now I saw it for what it really was, a phrase used to mask demands, to pressure me into compliance, and to silence my own needs. Their family first meant their convenience first, their priorities first, and my sacrifices first, always mine, never theirs. The weight of this realization was both terrifying and liberating. I felt the ache of years spent bending myself into a role that never included my desires or boundaries. For so long, I had swallowed the disappointment, convinced that love meant selflessness, without condition. But love, real love, had to include respect and reciprocity. I looked around the empty room, the quiet so complete it felt like a space waiting to be reclaimed. I thought about Mark's gentle words, "You deserve better," and how I had hesitated to believe them before. Tonight, they felt like a promise I was finally ready to accept. A cold determination seeped into my bones. I knew that if I continued to allow things as they were, I'd lose not only my energy, but my sense of self. The thought of spending the entire wedding day tethered to a battalion of children, invisible and uncelebrated, filled me with a defiant resolve instead of dread. I realized that boundaries were not betrayals, they were shields. Saying no wasn't selfish, it was necessary. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like the family's shadow or its unpaid help. I felt like a person reclaiming her space. The night stretched on as I sat with this new clarity, the silence around me somehow less oppressive and more like a canvas. I began to sketch out plans, not just logistical, but emotional. How would I protect myself? How would I say no without guilt? What would it mean for the relationships I'd held on to? Sometimes at the cost of my own happiness. The uncertainty was daunting, but it was also filled with possibility. I closed the journal and leaned back, breathing deeply. The knot in my stomach hadn't disappeared completely. It was a tight coil still there, reminding me of the battles ahead. But beneath it, a spark flickered. The beginning of a rebellion, quiet but unstoppable. This was no longer just about surviving a wedding or meeting family expectations. It was about standing up for myself for the first time in a long time. And whatever came next, I knew I wasn't going to disappear quietly anymore. That night, after I closed my journal and the house finally settled into silence, I sat at the kitchen table, my mind buzzing with a tangled web of thoughts. This wasn't just about one wedding or one day of babysitting. It was about the years, the sacrifices, the invisible labor, the way my family had come to depend on me like I was some kind of unpaid employee rather than a daughter or a cousin. If I was going to change the dynamic, I had to be strategic. I couldn't just say no and walk away without preparing myself for the fallout. I pulled out a fresh page in my journal and started listing everything they relied on me for. Childcare was at the top. Always childcare. Whether it was the toddler or a handful of cousins or my grandmother's appointments, I was the default caregiver. Then came event coordination, birthdays, holidays, funerals, and now Melissa's wedding. I was the one who handled seating charts, vendor calls, last-minute substitutions and crisis management, and of course, financial assistance. While I never wanted to be a bank, I'd lent money at key moments, to Melissa for her wedding budget, to my parents for repairs around the house, even to Jason on occasion when his unexpected expenses came up. None of this was ever acknowledged, but it was all expected. As I wrote, the weight of it sunk in anew. I was not just tired, I was carrying the family on my back, without thanks or recognition. And what's worse, I was being treated like some invisible service they could call on whenever convenient, with no respect for my own life or limits. The next step was to understand what I could do about it. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough to realize some of these informal arrangements weren't just unfair, they might be legally questionable. I reached out to a trusted friend who was a paralegal to get some preliminary advice. On the phone, I explained the situation carefully, not wanting to sound like I was complaining, but needing to know my rights. She was direct. "Zoe, if you're lending money, you should have written agreements. Without them, it's hard to enforce repayment. And when it comes to shared property or expenses, it's important to clarify who's responsible for what, especially with events like weddings. If you're paying or coordinating, you should have some say in the decisions." Her words echoed what I already knew deep down. I'd been giving too much, with no boundaries and no documentation, no contracts, no receipts, no formal acknowledgement of my contributions. It was all built on trust, and that trust was being taken for granted. I spent the next hour combing through emails, bank transfers, and texts. I found the money I'd lent Melissa for the catering deposit, the invoices I'd paid for rental equipment, even the messages where my mother casually asked me to cover this part, or handle that. I printed everything out, organized it in a folder, and made digital backups. This wasn't just for me, it was my shield, my proof, my leverage. At the same time, I knew I needed to protect my personal space and resources. I changed passwords on shared online accounts related to family events, the calendar app, the joint bank account used for party expenses, even the group chat settings. Slowly but surely, I removed myself from financial obligations that had slipped onto my shoulders without discussion. Mark supported this whole process. He helped me set up alerts on our joint accounts and reminded me to keep calm when the inevitable backlash came. Most importantly, I drafted a message in my head, something firm but composed, to send to my parents and Melissa. It would outline all these years of unpaid labor, the money I'd fronted, the emotional toll, and my decision to no longer be the default caretaker without consent or compensation. I wasn't ready to send it yet. It was a living document that I refined late into the night, balancing honesty with calm resolve. Throughout it all, I kept up appearances in daily life. At work, I was meticulous and professional, hiding the storm inside. On family calls, I answered politely but less frequently, letting the delays and silences do some of the heavy lifting. I even declined a few minor wedding-related favors, citing a busy schedule. None of it felt easy, but I knew these small tactical withdrawals were necessary to prepare the ground for a bigger boundary. As the days edged closer to the wedding, my resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about Melissa's event anymore. It was about reclaiming who I was, beyond the unpaid nanny, the invisible organizer, the emotional crutch. I was ready to stop being the family's default and start being Zoe, on my own terms. The question now was, when would I make that stand? And more importantly, how would they react when I did? The gradual shift began almost imperceptibly, like the slow turning of the tide beneath a calm sea. I started pulling back in ways that were subtle but deliberate. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation. I knew better than to think a sudden outburst would fix years of entrenched expectations. Instead, I chose small acts of resistance, the kind that would ripple quietly through our family's routines and force them to notice, if only a little. The family WhatsApp group chat was the first place I tested my new boundaries. Usually, I responded almost immediately to requests. Zoe, can you check the floral arrangements with the florist? Or, are you free to help set up the tables this weekend? Before, I would jump in without hesitation, feeling the pressure weigh down my shoulders but convincing myself it was just part of being family. Now, I let messages sit unread for hours. Sometimes, I didn't reply at all. When I did, my answers were brief and non-committal. A polite brush-off instead of the usual enthusiastic yes. One evening, Karen sent a message asking if I could come by the venue a day early to help with decorations. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering over the keyboard. The familiar pang of guilt flared, but I swallowed it down. Instead, I typed back, "Sorry, I have a work deadline that day and won't be able to make it." I didn't offer an alternative or an explanation. I simply closed the chat. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. A crack in the invisible wall that had always kept me trapped in servitude. When the next request came, this time from Melissa herself, asking if I could pick up some last-minute supplies, I responded that I was unavailable and suggested someone else might help. The silence that followed was telling. There was no immediate follow-up, no gentle coaxing or persuasive tactics. For once, my absence created a pause, a gap that others had to fill. At home, Mark noticed the change right away. "You're saying no more," he observed quietly one evening as we sat on the couch after putting our toddler to bed. His voice was full of admiration and relief, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "Good for you." His support felt like armor, strengthening my resolve when the familiar voices of doubt threatened to creep back in. Financially, I began to tighten the reins too. Over the years, I'd lent money to family members more times than I could count, always quietly absorbing the risk and disappointment when repayments lagged or never materialized. Now, I started to refuse these informal loans outright. When Melissa mentioned the budget shortfall for some wedding extras, I gave a firm but gentle, "No, I can't help financially this time." It was uncomfortable, like drawing a line in shifting sands, but necessary. I also stopped covering last-minute expenses, insisting that others take responsibility for their own costs. At the same time, I changed the passwords on all shared accounts related to family events and finances. It wasn't an act of rebellion, but a practical step to protect myself from being automatically roped into obligations without consent. I updated the password on the shared calendar app, which tracked all event-related tasks, and removed my name from payment plans for rental equipment and catering deposits. These were small administrative moves, but they symbolized a larger shift. I was reclaiming control over my time, energy, and resources. Aware that these changes wouldn't go unnoticed, I prepared myself emotionally for the inevitable fallout. I documented every interaction, every request, every refusal, every family message, in a dedicated notebook and digital folder. It wasn't about gathering ammunition for a fight. It was about clarity and self-preservation. I needed to keep track of the pattern, to remind myself why I was doing this, and to have evidence to support my decisions if questioned or challenged. Throughout this period, I maintained my usual composure in public and at work. To colleagues and friends, I appeared the same reliable, calm project manager they'd known for years. But inside, I was strategizing, balancing the emotional tumult that came with shifting long-standing family dynamics. I let the family calls go to voicemail more often, responding when I felt ready rather than out of obligation. When I did answer, I was polite but distant, my tone cooler, my availability limited. The family, for their part, seemed to notice the change but largely dismissed it. Karen, in particular, treated my reduced participation as a temporary mood or work stress. She sent occasional messages urging me to hang in there or suggesting I take it easy, oblivious to the deeper boundary I was setting. Relatives commented on my quieter presence but didn't press. It was as if they couldn't quite fathom that the dependable Zoe they counted on was consciously stepping back. This quiet withdrawal was a double-edged sword. It felt empowering to assert my limits, but it also stirred a deep sense of loneliness. I was breaking patterns that had defined my identity within the family for decades. There were moments when the familiar pang of guilt resurfaced, whispering that I was being selfish or shirking my duties. But then I'd remember Mark's steady presence, my own growing sense of self-worth, and the ever-tightening knot of exhaustion that had accompanied years of invisible labor. One evening, I declined another last-minute wedding favor, a request to help entertain the children during a rehearsal dinner. I texted a brief apology and explained I needed to focus on work deadlines. The response was a curt, "Okay," but the message that followed from a cousin was more revealing. "We really don't know how to manage without you." It was the first time someone outside my immediate circle acknowledged the true extent of what I'd been doing. Instead of feeling validated, I felt the weight of responsibility shift visibly onto others' shoulders, and a flicker of satisfaction warmed me. As the days to the wedding ticked down, I felt less like a martyr and more like a woman reclaiming her narrative. I had not yet made a public declaration or confrontation, but the foundation was laid. The quiet, tactical retreats were setting the stage for the bigger stand I knew I had to take. I was no longer the family's invisible caretaker. I was becoming an agent of change, one small, deliberate step at a time. And while the future was uncertain, the growing fire inside me was undeniable. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and clear. But for me, the usual flutter of excitement was replaced by a calm resolve. I sat quietly at the kitchen table, sipping my coffee as the sun streamed in through the window. The house was still, save for the soft sounds of Mark getting our toddler ready for the day. The usual buzz of frantic last-minute preparations in my mind was replaced by a singular focus. Today, I would no longer be the family's invisible caretaker. I'd made my decision days ago, and the plan had taken shape in the quiet corners of sleepless nights and whispered conversations with Mark. Today, I would not show up at the venue with a diaper bag and a bag full of snacks, ready to corral 10 children like a circus ringmaster. Instead, I was going to reclaim this day for myself, for my husband, for my family at home, for the person I'd been too long overlooked. Before I left, I drafted a message. Not angry, but firm, clear, and unapologetic. With a deep breath, I sent it to the family group chat, addressed to Melissa, Mom, and Dad. Melissa, Mom, Dad. For years, I have quietly given my time, energy, and resources to this family without recognition or thanks. From organizing events to watching kids, managing last-minute crises, and even lending money, I have been your default fixer, the unpaid nanny, the invisible support system. I have always done this because I care about our family, But the expectation that I'll simply be on call to manage 10 children all day at Melissa's wedding, excluded from the celebration, is not something I can accept. I am choosing to spend this day with Mark and our little one, enjoying the wedding as guests, not as servants. I hope you understand that respect and appreciation are the foundations of family, and without them, I cannot continue to sacrifice my own joy and dignity. I wish Melissa a beautiful wedding and a happy future. I encourage you all to find ways to share responsibilities and truly support each other. Zoe. I hit send and immediately felt a mixture of relief and a quiet tremor of anxiety. Had I said too much? Too little? Would this message ignite anger, disappointment, or worse, a family rupture? The answers didn't matter as much as the truth I had laid bare. I was done being invisible. As the hours passed, my phone remained eerily silent at first. Then, as expected, the storm broke. Messages flooded in, urgent, frustrated, pleading. Mom's texts popped up. Zoe, please, we're begging you. The kids need you. This is your family. Melissa's was sharper, bordering on accusatory. How could you do this? This day is important to all of us. You're ruining everything. Dad's voicemail was full of quiet disappointment, a tone I'd heard before, but never truly acknowledged until now. But I didn't respond. Instead, I sat with Mark and watched our toddler play, the sound of their laughter a balm to my bruised spirit. Meanwhile, at the wedding venue, chaos quietly unfurled. Without me there to coordinate, the carefully laid plans fell apart. The 10 children, unruly and restless, ran amok, darting between tables and climbing on furniture. Melissa's friends, unprepared and overwhelmed, struggled to keep the peace. The catering team, missing key instructions I had arranged, faltered. The seating chart remained incomplete, leaving guests confused about where to sit. Relatives whispered anxiously, casting glances toward the empty seat where I would have been. The very smooth, seamless event my family had promised was unraveling fast. Jason, usually poised and confident, found himself flustered and overwhelmed, unable to manage the children or step up to the logistical challenges. I could almost see the cracks forming in his facade, the pressure he'd never faced without my quiet orchestration behind the scenes. The tension was palpable, threaded through the beautiful floral arrangements and sparkling glassware like a silent storm. As the afternoon drifted toward the moment of the buffet, the atmosphere shifted from festive to fraught. Back at home, Mark and I sat in quiet solidarity, our phones buzzing relentlessly with calls and messages I deliberately ignored. This was my boundary in action. This was the day I stopped being the family's invisible labor and started reclaiming myself. I knew this was only the beginning. There would be fallout, hurt feelings, maybe even blame. But for the first time in years, I felt the power of choice, the strength of saying no. The wedding day was no longer a day of invisible servitude. It was the day I stood up for my dignity. And as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the room, I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. This was my moment, not to vanish into the background, but to finally be seen. The phone in my hand vibrated again. Another call from Mom. I stared at the screen, my breath catching in my throat. Karen's name flashed. Insistent, almost desperate. I silenced the ring, letting it go to voicemail. But then it buzzed again, this time Richard's number. I could almost hear the tone in their voices before I answered. The pleading, the layered guilt, the subtle accusations wrapped in concern. Zoe, please, Karen's voice came through, tight and trembling, laced with an urgency that made my heart ache and my resolve waver, if only for a moment. We didn't mean for it to get this far. The kids need you, sweetheart. We've all been counting on you. It's your family. Please come back. Melissa's wedding won't be the same without you there to help. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, feeling the familiar pull of obligation tug at me. But under that, there was something else bubbling, the simmering frustration of years of being invisible, overlooked, taken for granted. I could hear Richard softly adding, "We know it's a lot, Zoe. We're sorry if we made you feel unappreciated. We just don't know what we'd do without you." His words hit me like a weight pressing down on my chest, but I held firm. I didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch long enough for them, maybe, to feel the impact of their own dependence. Then the phone lit up with another call. This time it was Melissa. Her name on the screen felt like an accusation. I hesitated before answering, already bracing myself. "Zoe, please." Her voice cracked, the strain unmistakable. "I'm so sorry. I didn't want it to come to this. But without you, everything is falling apart. The kids are out of control. People are complaining. The caterers don't know where to set up. You're ruining my day." Her words felt like a slap, sharp and unfair. I could almost hear the tears breaking through the veneer of composure in her voice. "We needed you. I needed you. How could you just abandon us?" I swallowed hard, the sting of her blame burning me inside. "Melissa," I said softly, "I've spent years supporting this family in ways no one notices. Today, I chose to be present for my own family, for my own life. I'm sorry you're struggling, but I won't be the invisible worker behind your celebration anymore." The line went silent for a moment. Then she whispered, "I don't know what to do." I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't want to be the one to pick up the pieces anymore. As I put the phone down, Mark came up behind me, his presence steady and grounding. He'd watched it all unfold, the calls, the messages, the flood of emotions, and now he offered me a quiet reassurance. "They're panicking because they relied entirely on you," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's not your job to fix this for them. You made your choice." I nodded, the weight of years of silent labor finally pressing into the open air between us. Across town, at the wedding venue, the chaos was mounting. I'd seen the photos Mark's sister sent me, children running wild, tables left half-decorated, stressed relatives trying to corral the unruly kids. I could almost hear the raised voices, the frantic whispers among the staff. Jason, my brother, was overwhelmed beyond his usual polished demeanor. His jaw clenched tightly in the photos, a stark contrast to his usual confident smile. Without me orchestrating the background, the cracks in his carefully maintained image were clear. He struggled to manage the children, his usual charm replaced by visible frustration and helplessness. The caterers, missing key instructions I'd arranged weeks ago, were forced into improvisation. The seating chart confusion had guests wandering aimlessly, some ending up at empty tables, others squeezed into crowded spots. The smooth, seamless day the family had promised was unraveling in real time. Relatives whispered anxiously, glancing toward the empty chair near the kids' table, the one that should have been mine. The tension was thick, a silent acknowledgement of how much my absence mattered. Back in the quiet comfort of my home, Mark and I sat together, our phones set aside as the relentless buzz of calls and texts continued unanswered. I allowed myself to breathe, to let go of the tight knot of guilt that had gripped me for so long. This was my boundary in motion. This was the moment when silent sacrifice met firm refusal. I knew the fallout would come. Words spoken in anger, relationships tested, maybe even bridges burned. But for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. Power. Power to say no. Power to protect my time, my energy, and my dignity. As our toddler giggled nearby, chasing a sunbeam across the floor, I felt the sharp contrast between the chaos I'd left behind and the peace I was reclaiming. I wasn't just missing a family event. I was choosing to be seen, to be valued, to be more than a caretaker or a ghost in the background. The wedding day was no longer a test of endurance or invisible labor. It was a quiet revolution, a declaration that I would no longer be taken for granted. And as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through our living room window, I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. This was just the beginning. The ripple effect of my absence at Melissa's wedding was swift and undeniable. Word spread through the family grapevine and beyond, carrying a mix of whispered judgments and outright complaints. What should have been a day of celebration had instead turned into a spectacle of mismanagement, and the once pristine reputation of the Ellis family found itself fraying at the edges. Vendors, once enthusiastic partners in the event, began to voice their frustrations. The florist, who had painstakingly arranged the bouquets and centerpieces, complained about last-minute changes to the placement and missing setups. The caterers, thrown off by the confusion over timing and seating, quietly warned that they might reconsider working with the family for future events. The rental company called to report damages and missing equipment, a direct result of the chaotic handling of logistics without the usual oversight I provided. The professional image my family had painstakingly cultivated was crumbling in real time. Karen bore the brunt of the fallout. The matriarch, who had orchestrated much of the wedding planning with a tight grip on details and an unshakable trust in my ability to handle the kids, found herself under fire from relatives and vendors alike. I heard through several family members that she received pointed criticisms for her failure to delegate properly and for sidelining the very person who had kept things running smoothly for years. Her usual composed and commanding demeanor cracked slightly in private, revealing the strain beneath. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Karen doubled down on her stance, framing the chaos as an unfortunate but isolated incident. To the family circle, she portrayed herself as the concerned mother and grandmother overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. Behind closed doors, however, the tension simmered. I caught snippets from cousins and aunts who whispered about the mess and questioned why the go-to person wasn't there. Financial strains quickly followed. The family scrambled to hire last-minute childcare help, a costly expense that none of them had anticipated or budgeted for. The few people drafted to fill the gap struggled with the sheer number of children and the lack of preparation, exacerbating the sense of disorder. Some family members grumbled about the sudden outlay, while others expressed resigned frustration at how dependent they had become on me for managing these very tasks. More troubling, however, was the exposure of long-hidden faults. In the scrambling and finger-pointing, my years of documented sacrifices and financial assistance surfaced. Family members who had quietly tolerated, or even benefited from, my labor began to acknowledge, in hushed conversations or pointed remarks, the imbalance that had defined our relationships. The receipts, messages, and records I'd prepared made it clear that my contributions were not mere favors, but essential support that had gone unrecognized. This newfound transparency sparked mixed reactions. A few relatives approached me with tentative apologies and expressions of regret, their tone tinged with genuine remorse for having taken my efforts for granted. They voiced concerns that perhaps the family had relied too heavily on me, and tentatively asked how things could be different moving forward. Their cautious outreach felt like the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe some of them truly wanted change, but not everyone was ready to face the truth. A faction of family members doubled down on blame, painting me as the disruptor who had ruined the wedding and fractured family harmony. They dismissed my absence as selfishness and criticized my decision to set boundaries as betrayal. Old grievances resurfaced, and conversations turned cold and accusatory. I heard through the grapevine that some had questioned my motives, suggesting I had overplayed my role or exaggerated my sacrifices. The very family that had leaned on me for so long now cast me as the villain for stepping away. Community gossip began to trickle beyond immediate family circles. The wedding disaster became a cautionary tale in local social groups, an event marked by poor planning and family discord. Invitations for future gatherings became tentative, and some extended relatives hesitated to involve the Ellis family in their own milestones. The fragile network of trust and social capital my family had built over generations started to unravel. In the midst of this turbulence, Jason's facade cracked visibly. The golden child, once the picture of confidence and charm, revealed a vulnerability few had seen before. Suddenly, without my behind-the-scenes support, he struggled to manage the practical demands of the day. His usual ease was replaced by frustration and exhaustion, exposing his lack of readiness to shoulder responsibilities on his own. Those who had always admired his polished image began to murmur about his limitations, and I felt a mix of vindication and sadness witnessing his unraveling. Karen's situation was the most precarious. The criticism she faced from both family and vendors forced her into defensive postures, but it also opened the door to reflection, however reluctant. While her outward behavior remained stern and unapologetic, I sensed a crack in the armor, an awareness that things could not continue as they had. Whether that awareness translated to real change or just deeper entrenchment in old patterns remained uncertain. Despite the swirling accusations and fractured relationships, I held firm to my decision. The chaos, the blame, and the fallout were difficult to witness, but they laid bare the reality I had long suspected. My family had depended on me without truly valuing me. The exposure of this dependency was painful, but necessary. This chapter of upheaval had shaken the Ellis family's foundations. The old dynamics, favoritism, exploitation, silence, could no longer be taken for granted. What came next was a question hanging heavy in the air. Would this crisis become a catalyst for growth and respect, or would it widen the divides forever? For now, the family remained caught in the storm, grappling with the consequences of their choices and the absence of the person they'd long taken for granted. And I, having stepped into the light of my own worth, was ready to meet whatever came next, on my own terms. The days after the wedding passed in a haze of quiet determination for me. The storm of texts and calls from my parents, Melissa, and even some relatives gradually slowed, but I remained firm in the boundaries I'd set. This wasn't just about a single event anymore. It was about reshaping the very fabric of my family relationships. For years, I had been the invisible anchor, the unpaid labor, the default fallback, and now I was choosing a different path, one where respect, fairness, and shared responsibility were not just empty words, but non-negotiable terms for connection. I sat one evening at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the city drifting through the open window, and drafted a message that would become my new family manifesto. To my family, I love you all. But love cannot thrive without respect and balance. I am no longer willing to be the default caretaker, the invisible organizer, or the financial safety net without acknowledgement or consent. My time, energy, and well-being matter. If we are to continue as a family, it must be on terms of mutual respect and shared responsibility. I will engage and support where boundaries are honored. Otherwise, I must distance myself to preserve my peace and dignity. Thank you for understanding. Zoe. I reread the words and felt a profound sense of relief mixed with apprehension. Sending that message was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. I knew it risked ripples, maybe even cracks, in family ties, but I also understood that whatever happened next, I was no longer willing to be complicit in my own invisibility. More importantly, I turned my attention inward, focusing on the family that truly mattered in this moment. My husband, Mark, and our toddler. For so long, their needs were often secondary to the relentless pull of my extended family's demands. Now, that was shifting. I started carving out sacred spaces for us, breathing room where I could just be Zoe, the wife, the mother, the woman with dreams and limits. Mark noticed the change too. One lazy Sunday morning, as our toddler giggled on the living room rug, Mark caught my hand and smiled. "You're reclaiming your life," he said gently, "and it looks good on you." His unwavering support bolstered me, a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this new journey. We began scheduling family outings that were about joy, not obligation. Weekend park visits, quiet dinners, just the three of us, and small celebrations where I wasn't managing every detail, but simply savoring the moment. I reconnected with friends outside the family circle, sharing laughter and stories without the heavy undertow of duty. At work, I approached my projects with renewed vigor, buoyed by the clarity that came from setting these boundaries at home. I stopped canceling meetings for family emergencies that were no longer my burden to bear. I delegated more, trusting my team to handle complexities I once tried to micromanage alone. This ripple effect was liberating, and I began to see myself not just as a caregiver, but as a person with agency and worth. Meanwhile, Karen and Richard faced their own reckoning. The absence of my presence that day had exposed their over-reliance and the cracks in their family management. I sensed their discomfort in phone conversations, more apologies, more tentative attempts to reach common ground. But I held firm to my terms. I wasn't closing the door, but the entry was no longer wide open. Melissa, confronted with the chaos she had tried to avoid, began to show signs of reckoning as well. A few conversations revealed cracks in her entitlement, and while some wounds between us remained raw, there was a flicker of possibility for a different dynamic, one that didn't rest on exploitation. I learned that setting boundaries wasn't a betrayal of family, but an act of self-respect that could, paradoxically, opened doors to healthier connections. It was uncomfortable, yes. There were moments of loneliness and waves of doubt. But these were the growing pains of a family that had to evolve or fracture. The most powerful change, though, was internal. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could do for others. I reclaimed my voice, my choices, and my joy. Where silence and sacrifice had once defined my role, now clarity and courage shaped my path. And so, in the quiet aftermath of upheaval, I organized a small gathering. Just Mark, our toddler, and a few close friends. It wasn't a grand celebration, but a cozy evening filled with laughter, shared stories, and mutual respect. There were no expectations, no invisible labor, just presence and gratitude. As I looked around that room, feeling truly seen and valued, I realized something profound. Family isn't just those we are born into, but those who honor us, who meet us with respect and love on equal ground. My story with my parents and cousins is still unfolding. There are difficult conversations ahead, maybe even distance. But for the first time, I'm living life on my own terms. And that makes all the difference.